August 15, 1947. You stand among a crowd in Delhi as the Union Jack. The flag of the United Kingdom is lowered for the final time after nearly 2 centuries of dominance. Britain's rule over India, the shining jewel of its empire, abruptly comes to an end. But not out of compassion, nor out of a moral awakening, because Britain is bankrupt. World War II shattered its economy. The national debt had exceeded 200% of the gross domestic product. The treasury was completely empty, and without draining India's wealth, there was no way left to finance the empire. Here's what most people fail to realize. India's independence wasn't a miracle. It was a financial surrender. The British Empire didn't grant freedom. It simply no longer had the strength to hold on, and when India slipped away, the entire imperial system began to collapse. To understand how this empire fell, you must return to where it all began. December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a group of English merchants exclusive trading rights over the lands between the east of Africa and the west of the Pacific. It was called the East India Company, and this company would become the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. At first, it appeared harmless, trading spices, fabrics, and tea. But soon, this company began acting like a nation-state. By the early 18th century, it commanded a private army of 260,000 soldiers, a force twice the size of Britain's own army. A company with its own army, its own currency, its own kingdom. The turning point came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company obtained the Diwani, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This meant control over millions of people and one of the richest regions on earth. Within just a few years, the East India Company transformed from merchant to monarch, ruling, taxing, and exploiting at will. It monopolized salt, tobacco, and opium. It forced Indian artisans to sell their goods at 40% below market value. Weavers who had produced the world's finest fabrics for centuries suddenly became indebted laborers. Then came the Great Bengal famine between 1769 and 1770. Between 7 and 10 million people perished. The company offered no relief. Taxes continued as usual. They literally taxed people to death. This wasn't a policy failure. This was the policy itself. In 1750, India alone accounted for 1/4 of global industrial output. By 1900, that number had fallen to only 2%. Why? Because Britain didn't just occupy India. It systematically deindustrialized it. Indian markets were flooded with British goods, while British products were sold freely and duty-free. Indian producers were crushed under heavy taxes. British factories took India's cotton for free, processed it, and sold the same fabric back to India. Their profits were guaranteed, because competition had been completely destroyed. Between 1850 and 1896, textile imports from Britain to India skyrocketed, from 5 million to 18 million. India's legendary weaving industry was wiped out. Between 1600 and 1871, India's per capita income fell from over 60% of Britain's to just 15%. This was no coincidence. It was deliberate, systematic, and it made Britain unimaginably rich. Then came the next stage of corruption, the opium trade. The East India Company became the largest drug cartel in the world. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium. This poison was exported to China in exchange for large amounts of silver and tea. When China resisted this addiction, Britain responded by declaring war. The First Opium War between 1839 and 1842, and the result was obvious. Britain won. Britain had literally gone to war to defend its right to traffic drugs. The opium trade became Britain's second largest source of government revenue, right after land taxes. India had become both the empire's plantation and its victim. In 1857, Indian soldiers within the East India Company's own army raised the banner of revolt. It was one of the greatest uprisings in colonial history, but Britain's response was brutal. And once again, the bill was sent to India. The entire cost of suppressing the rebellion was paid through Indian taxes. They paid for their own defeat. After that, the British Crown took direct control of India. The East India Company faded into history, but the exploitation did not end, it merely changed form. The British reorganized the Indian Army, 65,000 British soldiers, and 140,000 Indian soldiers, to keep an empire alive. They were bound under the same flag, with different chains, all financed by the taxes of the Indian people. Railways are often described as Britain's great gift to India, but the truth is far darker. Between 1860 and 1890, India's railway network expanded from 1,130 kilometers to 25,000 kilometers, yet the entire cost was paid by India. Every piece of equipment was required to be purchased from Britain. India borrowed the money, paid for the construction, and Britain pocketed the profits. These railways were not built to help Indians, but to transport British soldiers and goods. Economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this system the drain of wealth. He calculated that Britain extracted between $30 and $40 million from India every year, while reinvesting less than $250,000. Naoroji called it vampirism, and he was right. When a nation's wealth leaves and never returns, that nation bleeds. This drain deepened even further during the World Wars. By 1918, more than 1 million Indian soldiers had fought for Britain. Over 150,000 were killed or wounded. But even that wasn't enough for Britain. India exported millions of tons of wheat, cotton, timber, and other supplies. Most of it was paid for by India itself. The colony even gave Britain a so-called gift of £100 million to fund the war effort. But this gift was in truth a debt paid in blood. The British Indian Army grew to 3.35 million soldiers, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed its war by burdening India with massive debts known as sterling balances. By 1945, India had become Britain's largest creditor. Then came the Bengal famine of 1943. Between 800,000 and 3.8 million people died, while India starved. Britain shipped food to Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill coldly remarked, "Indians must learn to look after themselves." He even suggested that India should pay for its own defense. This was the peak of imperial arrogance. When the war ended, Britain was finished. Its debt had doubled its economy. Exports had collapsed. The empire was completely bankrupt. The United States lent Britain $3.75 billion, and Canada another $1.9 billion. These debts continued to be repaid until 2006. But the empire itself was already dead. Without India's wealth, Britain's global machine could no longer run. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal. On August 15th, the flag came down. It was not an act of grace. It was a retreat born of desperation. In 1700, India made up 27% of the world's economy. By 1947, that number had fallen to just 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share had risen from 3% to 9%. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline. And when the drain stopped, so did the empire. After independence, India began rebuilding, struggling to regain the breath that had been taken from it for centuries. In 1947, the average life expectancy in India was only 27 years. By the end of the century, it had doubled. In just a few decades of self-rule, India achieved what Britain could not in 190 years. Britain may have won the war, but it lost its empire. The colonies were replaced by the Commonwealth, and by the 1960s, Britain had lost almost all of its territories. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world had become nothing more than a shadow of history. But history does not repeat itself exactly. It returns in echoes. Today, America stands where Britain once stood. 750 overseas bases, trillions in war debt, and a weakening financial system. Britain's power was built on colonial extraction. America's rests on the dominance of the dollar, global trade access, and military presence. But when debt piles up and the cost of empire outweighs its returns, collapse begins. Britain fell when it lost India. America may face the same fate when the dollar loses its global dominance. By 1945, Britain's debt had reached 200% of its GDP. America today is not far behind. History has already shown us what comes next. Empires do not fall in a day. They die slowly, through arrogance, overspending, and the belief that power lasts forever. The British Empire's trillion-dollar mistake wasn't just financial. It was moral. It was the belief that one could exploit the world forever without consequence. And when the bill finally came due, the sun that once never set on the British Empire finally did.